What happens when the people we trust with power lose the dignity to wield it? Today, you're going to hear what no one dares to say out loud. Words not from critics, but from insiders who were once on the inside of the room, in the heart of the storm. Leadership, true leadership, is not measured by how loud you speak or how forcefully you dominate a room. It's measured by how responsibly you carry the weight that comes with public trust. There's a tendency in our modern world to confuse brashness with boldness, arrogance with authority, and chaos with charisma. But leadership, real, enduring leadership, is quiet in its power and calm in its command. It doesn't need a spotlight. It doesn't chase applause. It simply does the work, even when no one is watching, because it understands the profound consequences of every decision, every word, every silence. When someone holds a position of national or global influence, their words don't just echo through the press conference room. They ripple through markets, through military chains of command, through foreign embassies, through homes where parents are trying to explain to their children what's happening to their country. And so with that power must come restraint. With that influence must come understanding. A leader doesn't always say what feels good, they say what is needed. They don't lead from the gut. They lead from the gravity of knowledge, history, and a deep awareness that every action matters. Let me give you an example. Imagine a scenario in which a global summit is underway, one where tensions between nuclear powers are at an all-time high. Intelligence officers have spent months preparing briefings, carefully constructing language that threads diplomacy through a minefield of rivalries. The military has contingencies ready, diplomats are on alert, and the leader of a nation steps onto that stage, not with caution or composure, but with an off-the-cuff remark that belittles another world power, mocks their leadership, and tosses decades of strategy into disarray. In that moment, a joke becomes a threat, a soundbite becomes a signal, and the world inches closer to chaos, not because a bomb was dropped, but because words were fired without care. That's the weight of leadership, and when it's not respected, people don't just lose faith, they lose safety. Now contrast that with the quiet moments of leadership we don't always see. The late-night calls with foreign leaders to prevent escalation. The private meetings with economists to navigate a financial crisis. The decision to wait, to reflect, to seek counsel before speaking to the world. That kind of leadership doesn't go viral. It doesn't trend on social media. But it's what stabilizes democracies. It's what keeps alliances strong. It's what lets the average citizen sleep at night, knowing that the person at the helm understands not just the mechanics of governance, but the humanity behind it. The problem arises when that weight is ignored, when the highest office is treated like a stage and policy becomes performance. We've seen officials, former allies, people who were once on the inside, step forward and share their disillusionment, not because they're disloyal, not because they have something to gain, but because they watch decisions being made based on ego, not expertise. They witnessed intelligence ignored, agencies sidelined, and allies alienated, all because the leader in question didn't understand, or worse, didn't care about the consequences. And when these people finally speak out, they don't just offer criticisms, they offer warnings. Warnings rooted in firsthand experience, warnings that say, the person entrusted with power did not understand its responsibility. This isn't just about decorum. It's not about how someone speaks or carries themselves. It's about outcomes. When leadership is treated as a vehicle for self-promotion rather than service, the ripple effects are felt everywhere. Farmers feel it when trade wars erupt over tweets. Teachers feel it when federal policies are gutted without consultation. Soldiers feel it when alliances are undermined on a whim. Parents feel it when their children ask, "Why is our president acting like that?" This isn't theoretical, it's personal, it's everyday. It's about the erosion of trust that happens when leadership becomes self-serving rather than selfless. And the truth is, this isn't a partisan issue. It's a principle issue. Because whether you vote left or right, conservative or progressive, every citizen deserves leadership that is thoughtful, informed, and anchored in reality. We can debate policy, we can disagree on ideology, but what we cannot afford is a leadership style that views facts as optional and accountability as an attack. That isn't strength. That's recklessness dressed up in confidence, and it places every citizen on unstable ground not because of external threats, but because of internal irresponsibility. When public officials speak, they speak in measured tones, carefully chosen words, and often through layers of press teams and talking points. But what they say behind closed doors tells a different story, a story that rarely makes it to the headlines, but one that reflects the true state of leadership, character, and the country itself. And when those private frustrations, doubts, and warnings begin to spill into the public, it's not by accident. It's a culmination, a breaking point, a moment where silence is no longer an option, not because of political rivalry, but because of moral clarity. When officials begin to unload not just criticism, but unfiltered descriptions like, "He's a effing idiot," it shocks the public, but it should also make them pause and ask, what drove someone who was once inside the room, who once defended this person, to speak with such blunt force? There is a vast difference between criticism that comes from outside the system and the truths that emerge from within. It's easy to dismiss detractors, to label them partisan, bitter, or opportunistic. But when the voices rise from those who sat in the Situation Room, who briefed the president daily, who advised on matters of war and peace, then we are not hearing politics, we are hearing history unfold. These aren't outsiders throwing stones. These are people who once held the stones, who helped build the house, and are now telling us it's on fire. Take, for instance, former high-ranking military officials, cabinet secretaries, and intelligence chiefs who remained quiet during their service, not out of approval, but out of duty. They endured impulsive decisions, blatant disregard for protocols, dismissals of expertise, and outbursts that risked diplomatic fallout. They watched as national security discussions were derailed by personal grudges, as facts were discarded in favor of conspiracy, and as public statements were made that contradicted hours of careful internal deliberation. These officials, bound by the weight of responsibility, often swallowed their concern in the moment. But that silence wasn't agreement. It was a temporary necessity, a sacrifice made to preserve institutional stability. Yet even they have a threshold, and when it's crossed, they speak. And when they do, the tone is different. It is not rehearsed. It is not polished. It is raw, often angry, deeply personal, because they're not just reporting facts. They're reliving a sense of betrayal. They entered those roles believing in the mission, believing they could guide, support, or temper the volatility they encountered. But over time, they realized the patterns weren't momentary lapses. They were constant, willful, and increasingly dangerous. What started as hope that the office would change the man turned into the realization that the man was trying to remake the office in his image. And that image, as they now admit, was one of recklessness, vanity, and profound incompetence. Consider a meeting where military leaders present a crisis scenario, perhaps an escalating threat in the Middle East or an urgent cyber attack. They lay out options, they provide intelligence, they recommend caution, but instead of thoughtful questions, they're met with rants about television ratings, bizarre conspiracy theories, or personal grievances against former allies. Imagine being in that room, watching the most powerful individual in the world treat nuclear diplomacy like a business negotiation, brush off advisors with decades of experience, and turn the solemnity of national defense into a spectacle. The officials in that room don't leave with pride. They leave with fear. And when enough of them leave with the same story, we have to stop dismissing them as disgruntled. We have to start hearing them as witnesses. These behind-the-scenes revelations are not leaks. They are warnings. They are accounts of a presidency or a period of leadership that went off script not to challenge the status quo for the better, but to bulldoze it for the worse. And when those who held clearance, who signed non-disclosure agreements, and who pledged allegiance to the Constitution, not a man, come forward, it is because they believe the public must know what was done in their name. They believe the integrity of our institutions cannot survive behind closed doors if the truth is locked in there with them. So they speak out, and what they say may be crude, may be shocking, but it is also sobering. We cannot afford to ignore the emotional tone behind their words, because behind every angry quote is a story of a moment when professionalism was met with pettiness, when preparation was derailed by ego, when national interest was overshadowed by personal obsession. These stories matter, not because they're dramatic, but because they come from those who tried to hold the line and are now telling us just how often that line was crossed. In international politics, credibility is currency. Nations may have powerful militaries, vast economies, and cultural influence, but without credibility, without consistency, stability, and respect on the world stage, they become unpredictable actors in a system that depends on trust. The United States for decades has held a position not just of power, but of responsibility. It has been a beacon, sometimes imperfect, sometimes flawed, but undeniably central to the architecture of global order. And that reputation was not earned overnight. It was built through decades of diplomacy, sacrifice, alliances, treaties, leadership in times of crisis, and a commitment, at least publicly, to democratic ideals. That reputation has allowed America to negotiate peace, influence global trade, deter adversaries, and inspire movements. But when leadership mocks international institutions, undermines alliances, and treats global affairs like reality television, that hard-earned reputation begins to fracture. When a president or any top official openly discredits the United Nations, NATO, the G7, or dismisses climate agreements with flippant tweets, it does not only alienate allies, it sends a signal that America is no longer a steady hand at the wheel. World leaders who once looked to Washington for coordination now begin to hedge their bets. They strengthen ties elsewhere. They explore new partnerships. They prepare for a world where the United States is no longer predictable, or worse, no longer trustworthy. And that shift doesn't happen in dramatic headlines. It happens in quiet boardrooms, in revised military strategies, in back-channel conversations between nations asking, can we still count on them? Take the Paris Climate Accord as an example. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a global agreement forged through years of negotiation with 190 countries committing to a common cause. When a leader unilaterally pulls out, citing nationalism over global cooperation, it doesn't just weaken climate efforts, it isolates America diplomatically. European allies, once unified on climate goals with the U.S., began drafting separate agendas. Emerging powers, seeing a vacuum of leadership, step in to fill the gap, and the credibility of the U.S. to lead on the most urgent challenges of the century begins to erode. Or look at NATO, an alliance formed on the premise that if one is attacked, all respond. For generations, that pact has been the bedrock of transatlantic security. But when a commander-in-chief refers to NATO as obsolete, mocks partner nations, and threatens to withdraw unless they pay up, it reduces a military alliance to a shakedown. It shows allies that their security is no longer a matter of shared values, but of transactional loyalty. And adversaries take note. They see division where there once was unity. They see weakness in what was once strength. Even simple diplomatic gestures, when mishandled, can send tremors through the international community. When meetings with autocrats are prioritized over decades-long allies, or when intelligence is shared recklessly with foreign adversaries in Oval Office conversations, it raises alarm not just about judgment, but about allegiance. World leaders begin to question, is the American presidency still the steadying force it once was, or has it become a wild card with a nuclear code? This erosion of reputation has real consequences. It affects trade deals. It delays international cooperation. It costs American companies contracts and markets. It risks military miscalculations when other nations no longer assume rational responses. It emboldens rogue regimes who now believe the American system is too distracted, too divided, or too disengaged to respond effectively. And perhaps most importantly, it impacts how everyday citizens in other countries view the American people, not just the president, but the values they're assumed to represent. Reputation is not just about prestige, it's about influence. When America speaks, the world has long listened, not simply because of its power, but because of its principles. But when leadership undermines those principles, when allies are insulted, science is denied, human rights are sidelined, and facts are treated like fiction, the voice of America loses its resonance. It becomes noise rather than signal, and in a world already teetering on crisis, from pandemics to wars to climate catastrophe, the absence of a credible American voice creates a void that someone else will fill, not always with benevolence, not always with liberty, not always with peace in mind. The global stage is not a platform for ego. It is not a place for impulsiveness. It is a delicate ecosystem of cultures, histories, grievances, and hope, balanced precariously on the assumption that some players act with restraint and maturity. When that assumption is shattered, when unpredictability replaces diplomacy, then the damage goes far beyond press conferences and late-night comedy shows. It becomes structural. It becomes strategic. It becomes irreversible in ways we won't even fully understand until years have passed and influence has shifted, not because America lacked power, but because it squandered trust. Power, by its very nature, demands responsibility. It demands reflection. It demands the humility to recognize that with every decision made from the seat of high office, lives are affected, not in theory, but in truth. A signature on a policy can close schools, cut health care, send troops into harm's way, or lift a family out of poverty. A few words spoken in anger or ignorance can spike oil prices, crash stock markets, or destabilize fragile regions. And yet, when power is held by someone who sees governance as a game, who makes decisions from impulse instead of intellect, the price paid isn't borne by the powerful, it's borne by the people. And that cost, often invisible to those in charge, is paid in delayed dreams, broken families, lost jobs, and flag-draped coffins returning from wars that never needed to be fought. We saw again and again how reckless power played out not in rooms of the elite, but in homes across the country. Take, for instance, the government shutdowns, sudden halts in federal operations, not because of thoughtful negotiation, but because of stubborn pride. Thousands of federal workers, including Border Patrol agents, airport security officers, and park rangers, went weeks without pay. Many had to take second jobs, borrow from retirement accounts, visit food banks just to survive, all while the cameras focused on the back and forth of political theater. For those in power, it was a game of leverage. For those on the ground, it was a quiet financial emergency that no one televised. Or look at the pandemic, a crisis that demanded steady leadership, clear communication, and trust in science. Instead, we witnessed a politicization of medicine, a refusal to act early, and a barrage of misinformation that cost lives. When a leader stands behind a podium and casually suggests unproven cures, downplays rising death tolls, or turns protective measures into partisan wedges, people suffer, people die. Not in distant places, but in nursing homes in Ohio, in hospitals in New York, in rural clinics in Arizona. The nurses who worked double shifts, the doctors who ran out of ventilators, the families who had to say goodbye to loved ones over FaceTime, they all paid the price for a government that chose optics over preparation, ego over empathy. And it doesn't stop there. Consider the impulsive decisions to withdraw from international agreements, not through consultation or strategy, but via social media declarations, pulling out of strategic military alliances without warning, abandoning Kurdish allies who had fought alongside American troops for years, all to satisfy a political narrative back home. These are not just policy shifts. They are betrayals. They are moments when reckless power discards human cost. The soldiers on the ground who had to face confused allies, the commanders who had to explain sudden changes in orders, the families who sent care packages to loved ones in regions no longer receiving coordinated support, they all paid a price for a lack of foresight and respect for process. Even in domestic policy, the cost of recklessness is evident. Slashing environmental regulations may win points with certain industries, but when children in industrial towns suffer from asthma, when rivers catch fire, when wildfires rage unchecked and communities are displaced, the people on the margins feel the weight. When tax policies are written to benefit the already wealthy, it's not just a line on a spreadsheet, it's a parent working 2 jobs and still not making rent, it's a young student giving up on college dreams because tuition is now out of reach, it's an elderly woman choosing between medication and groceries. This isn't theoretical, it's the lived reality of governance that lacks a moral compass. Power is supposed to protect the vulnerable, not exploit them. It's supposed to uplift the forgotten, not punish them for being poor or unconnected. But when power is held by someone who sees leadership as a tool for self-gratification rather than public service, then cruelty becomes casual. Dignity becomes expendable. Decisions are made not with the long-term good of the nation in mind, but with the short-term thrill of applause, ratings, and dominance. And what makes it more devastating is that many of these decisions are cloaked in spectacle. Press conferences filled with bravado, rallies that turn public service into personal entertainment, words that insult instead of inspire. All of it feeds a cycle where performance replaces policy, where division replaces unity, and where the very institutions designed to safeguard the republic are bent to serve one man's ambitions. And in the wake of all that theater, real people are left picking up the pieces, alone, unheard, and too often uncounted. There is a particular weight that truth carries when it comes not from critics or outsiders, but from those who were once on the inside, those who walked the halls of the West Wing, who sat in classified briefings, who stood beside the podium as decisions were announced to the world. These individuals didn't begin as opponents. Many of them joined the administration with the hope of serving their country, of using their expertise to guide policy and help shape the future. Some were decorated generals, lifelong diplomats, intelligence veterans, or respected policymakers. They didn't seek fame. They didn't crave attention. In fact, many of them were unknown to the public when they took their positions, but something changed. Over time, these insiders witnessed a level of dysfunction, recklessness, and dishonesty that became impossible to ignore, and eventually impossible to stay silent about. When people like this speak out, it is not a partisan act. It is an act of conscience. These are individuals who risk their careers, reputations, and personal safety to tell the American people what they saw. And what they describe isn't just disagreement over political ideology. It's a portrait of a presidency unmoored from truth, untethered from discipline, and uninterested in anything that doesn't serve personal gratification. They speak of intelligence being ignored, of national security being compromised for political convenience, of policy decisions made not through deliberation, but on a whim, often in reaction to cable news or Twitter trends. They speak of systems that were supposed to safeguard the country being undermined from within, not by foreign enemies, but by those entrusted with power. One former cabinet official described their time in the administration as trying to build a dam with your hands while the floodwaters rise behind you. Day after day, they attempted to steer policy in a responsible direction, only to find that careful planning was constantly undone by impulsive tweets, personal vendettas, or bizarre obsessions. These were people who had spent decades serving under multiple administrations, who had worked through wars, recessions, and crises, and yet they found themselves in an environment where loyalty to one person mattered more than loyalty to the Constitution, where speaking the truth in a briefing room could get you sidelined and telling the leader something they didn't want to hear meant your days were numbered. And when these insiders finally left, they didn't go quietly because they wanted attention. They went public because they felt a moral obligation. Some published op-eds or memoirs. Others testified under oath. A few even remained anonymous, not out of cowardice, but out of fear that their families would be targeted. And yet, despite the risks, they spoke, because they knew that silence in the face of such dysfunction would make them complicit. And the stories they told were not sensational. They were sobering. They describe briefings where critical information was ignored if it didn't align with the leader's narrative. Meetings where foreign policy was shaped not by strategic interest, but by how much a foreign leader praised or flattered the president. They told of phone calls where long-standing allies were insulted, intelligence services were disrespected, and decisions were reversed without warning or consultation. In one instance, a senior military advisor recalled trying to explain a complex security issue only to be interrupted and told to focus instead on arranging a parade. These are not anecdotes designed for drama. They are glimpses into a leadership style that prioritized ego over national interest. And it's important to understand the courage it takes to speak out after being inside. In Washington, access is currency. Relationships are power, and those who speak up often lose both. They are blacklisted from future roles, attacked on social media, dismissed as bitter or disloyal. But what we're seeing here is not bitterness, it's burden. A burden that comes from carrying truths that were too dangerous to ignore. Because at some point, when you see the machinery of government being twisted to serve one man's insecurity, rather than the people's needs, you have to ask yourself, what do I owe more, my loyalty to a person or my duty to the country? And what makes these testimonies so powerful is that they are not coming from a place of political ideology. These insiders come from across the spectrum. Some are conservative, some progressive, some apolitical altogether. But they are united by one thing, a shared experience of watching a leader reject the responsibilities of the office and replace them with personal indulgence. They witnessed firsthand how truth was not just devalued, it was treated as an enemy. And in that atmosphere, governing became impossible. Policy became theater, and truth became collateral damage. There comes a moment in every generation when the question is no longer about politics or partisanship, but about principle. A moment when the future isn't decided by polls, parties, or platforms, but by conscience. We are living in such a moment because what's at stake isn't just who occupies a particular office, but what kind of country we want to live in, what kind of nation we want to pass on, and what kind of people we are willing to become. The outrage, the dysfunction, the chaos that so many have grown used to isn't just a reflection of one man's behavior, it's a reflection of what we have allowed, of what we've excused, of what we've normalized again and again in the name of loyalty, in the name of winning, in the name of not rocking the boat. But the boat is rocking, the water is rising, and conscience is the only thing left that can anchor us. The words of former officials who once stood beside this leader, who defended his policies, who tried to steer the ship from within, should not be seen as revenge. They should be seen as red flags. Not because they dislike the man, but because they've seen what unchecked power without character looks like up close. They've seen how easy it is for institutions to bend, how quickly truth can be buried beneath noise, and how dangerous it becomes when millions of people are convinced that facts are lies and lies are truth. And that danger isn't theoretical. It has real-world consequences. It shows up in the threats made against election workers, in the fear felt by journalists doing their jobs, in the silence of good people who are too afraid to speak because they've watched what happens to those who do. This is why conscience matters, because there is no law, no policy, no system that can survive long if the people operating within it have abandoned their moral compass. You can have a constitution, you can have a Congress, you can have courts, but if those who hold power treat truth as negotiable, if they reward cruelty and punish decency, if they celebrate division rather than heal it, then even the strongest democracy begins to rot from within. And that rot doesn't begin at the top. It begins when everyday people stop demanding better, when they settle for the bare minimum of leadership, when they accept that lies are just part of the game, and that character doesn't matter as long as their side wins. But history teaches us that nations are not defined by their worst moments. They are defined by how they respond to them. And conscience is the first spark of that response. It is the veteran who refuses to stay silent after watching military values be insulted. It is the former staffer who steps forward and says, "No, that's not how it happened." It is the citizen who breaks from the crowd and chooses truth over comfort. We have seen this before in moments of civil rights, in times of war, in eras of scandal and injustice. America moves forward not because the powerful suddenly find their way, but because ordinary people remember what they believe in and act accordingly. One example that stands out is that of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, a military officer with a Purple Heart who chose to testify about a phone call he knew violated his oath, not because he hated the president, but because he loved the country. He knew the cost. He knew he would be targeted, and he was. He lost his position. He was smeared in public, but he never wavered, because for him, conscience wasn't optional. It was integral to who he was, and that's what this country needs more of. Not perfect people, not saints, but leaders, citizens, and yes, insiders who choose integrity over convenience, who recognize that silence may be easy, but it is never neutral. We are being tested, not just by what one person says or does, but by how we all choose to respond. And if we allow our standards to be eroded, if we keep lowering the bar until nothing is unacceptable, then we are not victims of our circumstances. We are participants in our decline. But if we reclaim conscience, if we remember that leadership is about service, not self, about duty, not domination, then there is still time to write a different chapter. Not by erasing what happened, but by learning from it, by listening to those who were there, and by choosing finally to be better than the worst we've tolerated.